life group leaders. This is week 16 of Story Through the Old Testament, and it's a great story of Ruth restored and redeemed. And if you haven't just taken time to read through the whole passage, the one suggested here on the beginning page, I would advise you to do that. Just reading through it, it's a beautiful story, how God orchestrates things and brings about His plan even in the midst of tragedy. And so I'm not going to recount the whole story for you. I'm going to let you do that as you read through it. But one of the things that this story brings out, I think is important, is not Ruth's, but Naomi's bitterness. Like she's had tragedy in her life. Her husband and both of her sons have died, and there she is in a foreign land without anyone to help her. So really what you have is a woman here that has no prospects and no one to help her. A widow in that day and time would have been extremely vulnerable, and she was in a foreign land. And so that's why she was bitter, because she felt like the Lord had given her a raw deal, for lack of a better way to say that. And so why did she decide to return to Bethlehem? Because that's the place where her family was. They had left Bethlehem during that famine, and as the pre-story describes, maybe some felt like that the death of her husband and sons was judgment on their family for leaving the protection of God and going to the Moabites to find what they needed. And so, but she was just going back home. Why did it make more sense for Ruth and Orpah to return to Moab? Well, it made more sense because that was their kinsmen. They would be able to find husbands. They would be able to have a family. But for Jewish people, the Israelites, to marry a non-Israelite, God didn't want them doing that. And so here you have someone that is coming to this land where it seems like there will be no prospects and no possibility for her provision, and yet God works it out where she is redeemed. So as we know, Ruth ends up in Boaz's field, and how did Boaz treat her? Well, he treated her very compassionately and kindly. He said, "Stay with my female servants," and he gave instructions that his male servants were not to touch her. They were to he basically protected her in that foreign culture where she could have easily been taken advantage of. The most interesting question to me in this is on the bottom of page 99, where it says, in what ways did Ruth demonstrate faith by following Naomi's plan? What risks did she take, and what might have happened if Boaz did not respond favorably? Well, I think we can even go back prior to this and say that Ruth's faith was demonstrated, and we can see how this plays out because of what she said to Naomi whenever they first came back to Bethlehem. She said, "For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me." So I think it's important there that we see that she says, "Your God will be my God." She has demonstrated faith in God, and she knows that Naomi is a godly woman, and so she demonstrates faith in the fact that she is following Naomi and her God, and Naomi wants her good. And so she did take risk, because if she would have gone to that threshing floor and Boaz had responded wrongly, if he would have thought that she was trying to prostitute herself, to make a way into his life by seduction, then he could have very much rejected her. He could have pointed her out as a prostitute. He could have really brought much shame on her and Naomi, which would in turn would have really decimated them in regard to finding someone that would redeem them, somebody that would provide for them. And so she did take great risk, um, but that's not what he did. He wanted to make sure that nobody, that she didn't tell anybody that she came to that threshing floor. He gave her some grain, so it looked like she was just there to purchase grain for her and Naomi. But he understood that, she had treated Naomi with kindness, and she had provided for her and refused to leave her, and so he commended her for that. This marriage between Ruth and Boaz really did benefit Naomi, because it says in the text that she became the nanny for the baby that Ruth had with Boaz. And so there was provision made not only for Ruth, but there was provision made for Naomi. Ruth's commitment to her is, that nothing would separate them except death. And she called a judgment of God on her if anything had separated them. So there was going to be provision for Naomi. And even the women, the neighbor women there said that a son has been born to Naomi. And so, like, there was the shame that was on her, I don't know how else to say it, but just the shame that was on her for losing her husband and sons has now been removed because she has been redeemed along with Ruth. And now there's been descendants born to her sons, and that as a result, it is her descendants as well. It says, what famous descendant came from Boaz and Ruth's marriage? And obviously, it says here at the last that Obed was the father of Jesse, and who was the father of David. And so, the most famous descendant of Boaz and Ruth is Jesus. I mean, she's mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew. And so here we can see how God took tragedy and used it in His plan for redemption. And the question that really will get personal to people here is, what does this story teach us about God's compassion for widows and others in need? Well, that one's good too, but I meant the next one. Has any situation in life made you feel bitter and hopeless? What does this story teach us about God's ability to redeem tragic situations, and how might He redeem your tragedies? I think we can tie this into Romans chapter 8, that it is God's plan to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ. And so in that, He is going to use hardship. He is going to use suffering. And what does Paul say there? That those things are not worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. And we have to remember that all of the hardships that come along our way are God is using to mold us and shape us. I was talking to a couple different people even this week about hard things that they were going through, and one of them was my son, and I just thought how close to home that hit me, because he's going through some of the same things that I went through whenever I was his age. And I just thought, wow, how God used those things whenever I was a teenager to now be able to help me be able to relate to my own son in the situation that he's going through. And if I hadn't experienced those things, I would not be prepared to help him in this situation. And while that's obviously not in the overall arching theme of redemption, I do believe that our lives are shaped and formed by God, so that we can then impact other people's lives, that He is conforming to the image of Jesus Christ. And so, all of these things that happen to us, while they are not enjoyable, if we look at them in the big picture of what God's doing, we know that they have purpose and they have meaning, and God is using them. And so our life as believers, we have to submit it to the sovereignty of God and say, whatever we're going through, there's a purpose and a plan in it. And so just help people work through that process of understanding. And you know what? If they're not there yet, that's okay. Like don't condemn anybody because they don't have that understanding or they just haven't worked through. God hasn't brought them to the point where they can accept that yet. Because people go through really, really hard stuff, and part of that struggle is the means by which God conforms us. And so it's not as if tragedy happens and instantly we understand. Naomi did not instantly understand. She was bitter for a long time, and then at the end, she saw how God had worked and how He brought about a redeemer, and they were restored. And so ultimately, this is about Jesus and the way He redeems, and we need to look at it as pointing to Him. But even in that, we understand that He does that in our life as well. All of us who are believers have been in the point where Naomi and Ruth were, and God has redeemed us because Jesus is the kinsman redeemer. So that's about all I got for this week. For most of you all, this will be the last session of life groups for this semester. And so I hope you've had a great time with that. Please get with me. I'll be sending out a text asking for you to respond with ideas of who could give testimonies at our life group testimony night on the 10th. So have a blessed week.